Full to have your your lectures and wise counsel and all those good things. And that being said, I'm going to turn it right over to you so we won't waste any valuable time.
Well, thank you so much, Sylvia, and thanks to all of you for coming again today. Um, we have I worry today because today is the day that we get up. I'm going to bring it up right up to the present, and so this is where it's easy to talk about 1800. It's harder to talk about 2020, and so just be aware that is some of the stuff I'm going to talk about today has been part of your life, and it will be getting very close to home. The intention is not to step on anyone's toes, though I'm stepping on mine all the time, so so be it, you know what I mean? And so I hope that you'll approach this conversation in today's lecture especially with that in mind, and I hope that you'll have a posture of curiosity. And so the first week we covered the construction of race and racially based slavery, really. And then the second week, last week, we covered Civil War and Jim Crow, and we really started thinking about what exactly do the prophets or the truth tellers, is there anything they hold in common? And so today, I want to come up through the 20th century and up to today. And I want to, in order to do this, because that's still a lot of information, the thread I want to follow today is civil rights, or the struggle for civil rights, so that we can kind of hang everything on that story. What does the struggle look like for civil rights? And the thing I want to consider most is where Christians, so we're going to be thinking about where Christians opposed civil rights, or opposed racial discrimination, or where Christians oppose civil rights or support civil rights, where Christians oppose racial discrimination, or where Christians support racial discrimination. So again, this is a hard story, and I want to cover this story in four kind of moves. Okay, so just so you know what's coming. First of all, I want to look at some early civil rights leaders. Okay, so we're going to look at 4 or 5 early civil rights leaders who are Christians. And then I want to look at Christian segregationists. That's the second thing. So we'll look at early leaders, then we're going to look at segregationists and sort of understand their logic, especially Christian logic. And then I want to the third move will be looking at the civil rights movement, right? So the new era of the civil rights movement. There's a long civil rights movement, but this new era in the 1950s and 60s. And then finally, the place I hope we can spend most of our time is the fourth move, which is looking at Christian race relations from 1970, after the civil rights, to 2020. So again, we're going to cover a lot of information. Most of my slides we're going to be on for less than a minute or whatever. So we're going to move through, but that's the big picture that we're going to look at, right? 20th century civil rights. Where have Christians joined the struggle, and where have Christians opposed it? So with that said, let me go ahead and share my screen, and we'll get rolling. All right, can you see that okay? Is that showing up correctly? Okay, good deal. All right, well, let's get going then. Okay, so first of all, Christian civil rights leaders. We talked last week about Frederick Douglass, right? And Frederick Douglass is the one who really laid down the truth in unequivocal ways. He unequivocally condemned any type of quote unquote Christianity that supported race-based slavery. And so we talked about that. He was really, really important to critique racism and to advocate for civil rights. And everybody kind of looked back to him as a major leader. After that, though, one we didn't talk about last week, who's really, really important, he could be considered sort of the father in some ways of liberation theology, even though James Cohen gets that title. This is a really early one. So Henry Mcneill Turner, who you see pictured here, he grew up in the South. He was a chaplain in the Union Army. He worked for the state legislature of Georgia during Reconstruction. So he was one of those people in that 10-year period where Black people not only became free, but then entered for a moment into public life. He was also a major leader in the AME Church. Okay, so he's Methodist Episcopal Church, and he is the first one to articulate this idea that God is Black. So let me read you a quote. I've got a shorter quote on here for you, but I'll read you the whole quote, which ends with what you see on the screen. He said, "We have as much right biblically and otherwise to believe that God is a Negro," right? So this is the politically correct term at the time, "as you or white people have to believe that God is a fine looking, symmetrical, and ornamented white man. For the bulk of you and all the Negroes of this country believe that God is, and all the full Negroes, he says, of the country believe that God is white-skinned, blue-eyed, straight-haired, projected-nosed, compressed-lipped, and finely robed white gentleman sitting on a throne somewhere in the heavens. But then he says every race of people who have attempted to describe God by words or by paintings or by carvings or by any other form or figure have conveyed the idea that the God who made them and shaped their destinies was symbolized in themselves. And why should not the Negro believe that he resembles God? So he will, Turner's ideas here and continue ideas later on will be very important for reconfiguring the conception in America of what God even looks like. And folks will get even more clear about that as we move through this lecture, get into some folks later on. We talked also last week about Ida B. Wells, but I wanted to highlight her again. She was a journalist who used her talents and her deep religious faith to really expose lynching culture. So first, she actually sued a train company in Memphis in 1884. And she won locally, but she lost federally. But what happened in the early 1890s is one of her friends, Thomas Moss, and two of his friends were lynched by a white mob. And because they ran a prosperous grocery store, that was it. They were Black people who had become a little bit prosperous, and so they were lynched. And so she started writing about lynching. And in 1892, especially, she put out her book Southern Horrors, which had international readership. And the locals in Memphis drove her out through terror tactics. And she ended up landing in up north in Chicago, and she continued to use her voice and her journalism to expose lynching. And she did this from a position of deep religious faith. Another person that you might be aware of, and we talked about a little bit last week, was W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, he himself rejected Christianity, the Christianity that he had received in his youth, but he did use Christian symbolism in his writing. So he recognized the key role of Christianity in African American culture. And his famous book was, he's got this 1903 book called The Souls of Black Folk. If you've not read it, read it. It's a foundational book in the canon of African American literature. People today, writers today, like Ta-Nehisi Coates, continue to use his imagery of this veil and the two-ness of the Black experience, or double consciousness of the Black experience in America. So he kind of lays down those ideas. But one of the things that he said, I don't have time to read it to you today, but if I had time, I would read this, and I'm going to encourage you to go and read this. But he wrote this, A Litany of Atlanta. I actually read it. I try to channel my inner W.E.B. Du Bois to my students, and I read this with as much gusto as I can passion, because what happened, it's called A Litany of Atlanta. It was 1906. In 1906, there was a massive race riot in Atlanta. It wasn't much different from Ida B. Wells's stuff earlier on in the 1890s. White people in Atlanta had gotten very angry because Black people were starting to become prosperous in Atlanta. And so you had politicians, white politicians, making a move to take away Black civil rights. And then you had a couple of newspapers being very irresponsible and stoking racial fear. Long story short, because I don't have time to tell you the whole story, and these politicians, by the way, were planning to take away, use poll tax or take away the Black vote. They were proposing this. So there's a massive, what you end up with is this mob. You have a white mob going out of about 5,000 men, begin ripping Black people out of trolley cars and barbershops, chasing them down in streets. When it's all said and done, there are 25 Black people dead and 2 white people dead. And when the smoke clears, and the blood is cleaned, W.E.B. Du Bois nationally puts out this, it's a poem and a prayer, A Litany of Atlanta. And again, I'll encourage you to read it, because it would take me 5 or 6 minutes to read, and I'm not gonna do that now. But it begins with, O silent God, and it ends with, O silent God. And it is a powerful reflection on a Christian theology of the silence of God amid the destruction of Black bodies. And it is a powerful, powerful reflection. So I encourage you to read it. In it, he, reflects on, well, again, I'm not reading it, so I'm going to stop. I'm going to move on and say, hey, there's a resource if you want to understand the Black experience from some of these folks. Another major leader, people don't know Howard Thurman as well as they know MLK. Thurman grew up Baptist. He eventually took on Unitarianism, but from this sort of Christian religious perspective, he inspired many, many, many civil rights leaders, including MLK. And his most famous book probably is Jesus and the Disinherited from 1947. That is Jesus and the Disinherited. I probably should have put an image of that up here for you. But in that book in 1947, Thurman explored the ways that American Christianity had supported white supremacy. All right. And he especially noted how segregation in America had damaged the psyche of Black Americans. And he argued that the white God of American Christianity was a constant harm and a constant abuse to Black people. And so, like, it was a lot like Turner before him, right? He said, Thurman says that American Christians imagined God to be, and I'm quoting him here, an elderly, benign white man seated on a white throne with bright white light emanating from his countenance, right? So you have whiteness at the pinnacle of divinity. And then he said, in the American Christian mind, the devil and his minions are imagined as black. And this color hierarchy played out in society. And this imagination, this religious imagination, shaped everyone's encounter of white and Black people on the streets. And so he argued that American Christianity, through this and other ways, provided religious sanctification for segregation. But he argued that authentic Christianity was actually on the side of the oppressed, and that Black and white Christians alike should really find in Christianity the religious critique of segregation, the religious critique of oppression, and the religious critique of inequality, right? So that's Howard Thurman. And for any of these people, right, we could spend a whole day unpacking their thoughts. I'm just trying to make sure you're aware of some of these. Another individual, and this is the last one I'm going to highlight, is James Farmer. And by the way, Howard Thurman taught at Howard University, and Farmer was one of Thurman's students at Howard. And so Farmer studied under Howard Thurman, and he took up the principle of nonviolent civil disobedience. Thurman had articulated that. These individuals were also reading Gandhi, who was upending oppression in India at the same time. They were also reading Jesus and his nonviolent principles, and they were bringing it together in this nonviolent civil disobedient platform to advance civil rights. All right, so Howard Thurman was really important in that, but so is James Farmer. And so he did believe in Jesus, Farmer did, but he chose not to follow his father into the pulpit. Why? Because he just said he could not envision preaching in a segregated and thus a discriminatory church. That is, he rejected the pulpit and the pastorate because of the witness of the church, because it was segregated and it didn't have his witness straight. Now, he continued to believe in Jesus. He founded what is known as CORE, that is the Congress on Racial Equality, which led many of the civil rights efforts throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Now, these are just some of the individuals, right, and organizations that were opposing racism and working for civil rights. Now, here's the deal. I've just talked about these 5 or 6 Black leaders. And so I've centered Black voices because they were the leaders. But there were white Christians involved in this struggle. In fact, if I had time or would have thought about it before just now, I would have put up another image, because in correspondence this week with Ann O'Connor, who has been in our class, I learned that Lillian Smith, who wrote the book Strange Fruit in the 1940s, is Ann's great aunt, which is really, really cool. And so not only did white people join the fight, we even have relatives, right, of some of the folks here in our class who were really courageous allies. And by the way, Strange Fruit is the title of Billie Holiday's 1939, how do you describe this song? It's a haunting song about lynching, this strange fruit hanging from southern trees. And so I encourage you to check that out. So who knows the other voices, right? Just even here in our class of folks who joined the struggle. But let's keep moving now to our second category. I want you to make sure you understand that there were some racist Christian responses to these individuals and the movements they were starting, right? And so I'm just calling them segregationists. We could do it a different way if we wanted to, like Christian foundations for oppression, Christian foundations to oppose civil rights, Christian foundations for segregation. And the most important one was, and vicious one was the KKK. So the second burst of the KKK, that is Take Two, came about in the 1910s and the 1920s. And it was in response to some of the Black advancement and the racial paranoia that was going on in the white communities. And so it was really led by a Baptist minister named Thomas Dixon Jr., pictured here with his wife. He promoted white supremacy in his best-selling novels. Maybe you've heard of them: The Leopard's Spots, A Romance of the White Man's Burden, 1865 to 1900. He published that in 1902. And then The Klansman, a historical romance of the Ku Klux Klan, that was published in 1905. And so these stories, they really romanticize the lost cause civil religion that we learned about last week. And they romanticize the KKK as protectors of white racial purity and the Confederate Southern cause. Dixon really demonized Black people, and he promoted this idea that Black people used their freedom to sexually victimize pure white women. So he championed the Confederate South and its racial hierarchy. He hated the 14th Amendment and the New South. And so what happened then is uh, film director D.W. Griffith adapted one of Dixon's novels, one of these Baptist novels, in what became a blockbuster silent film, Birth of a Nation, 1915. This goes in all of the history of film storybooks, because it just took took America by storm. So this film depicts Black people who are usually played by white people in blackface. It depicts Black people as savages. One of the main narratives is a Black man seeking to rape a white woman, and she throws herself off a cliff to preserve her purity, white purity. And the Klan then avenges this act, and then not only avenges the act, but also works to redeem the South by returning it to its racial past and reviving the Confederacy. President Woodrow Wilson, you may know, showed this film in the White House, and Wilson allegedly said that the movie was, and I'm quoting here, like writing history with lightning. Like writing history with lightning. He loved this film. Of course, you all remember, right? This was the Lost Cause revision of history, a thoroughly racist and inaccurate in almost all of its ways, details of an American past. So the books and the film were so popular that they led to a rebirth of the KKK. And that rebirth happened when a Methodist minister and a group of white men ascended Stone Mountain. Some of you probably know about Stone Mountain down in Atlanta, near Atlanta. And they had ascended Stone Mountain, on the top of Stone Mountain, and held a ceremony there with the American flag and a Bible at its center. So they brought together all the things that were the lost cause civil religion, right? They get on top the largest monument to the Confederacy and to white supremacy. Then they bring the Bible and the American flag, and they inaugurate the new movement of the Ku Klux Klan. There were three major, what they called, and I've got these in quotes, right? They say the new version of the Klan, and they were open about this. This is in their foundational literature about their platform. The three great racial instincts of the white race. I'm literally taking this directly from their literature. So here are the three, what they call the great instincts of the white race, okay? First, they argued that the KKK argued that the American race was white and pure. So to be American was to be white and pure. In fact, they called their movement Americanism. I mean, right, this is a euphemism. They meant white supremacy, but they called it Americanism. The American race is white and pure, and they said any mixing of the races would destroy not only the white race, but also the American race. Therefore, race mixing was not only disgusting, but it was also, they said, unpatriotic. Their second thing they argued explicitly for white supremacy. They said the only way forward in the fight for life was to conquer the other races. So the only other options were to die or to become enslaved. This was their argument. So the continuing progress of civilization depended on white supremacy and white domination. And the third plank in their platform was that the KKK argued that the American or the white race was religiously Protestant. So Protestantism was absolutely essential. The KKK was fiercely anti-Roman Catholic, fiercely anti-Jewish. They thought America would never have been great, nor could it continue to be great without Protestantism at its core. So Protestantism, they argued, was an expression of the highest achievements of what they called, get this, the Nordic race, right? So now they're starting to sound a lot like the Nazis about the same time. All other people, they said, seek the destruction of the Nordic race and the Nordic religion. America must remain Protestant if the Nordic race will fulfill its destiny. So they inextricably intertwined Protestantism, white supremacy, and America. This is white Christian nationalism in 1910s. So with that three-part platform, the KKK grew enormously, right? This is not some backward, in the woods, nobody's joining this thing. They had 3 to 5 million members by the 1920s just in the North. Just in the North. They built headquarters in Indiana. They were not hidden. They had these two massive marches, one of which you see here. Now, there were debates, right, in America about whether or not in the 1920s, whether or not a white supremacist organization should be allowed to parade around the Capitol. But the compromise was you're allowed to parade around the Capitol as long as you show your faces. And so that's why in all these pictures I've been showing you from the 1926 parade, you see their faces. And in fact, in 1924, they lobbied successfully to get the 1924 Immigration Act passed, which drastically limited immigration from select countries, right? So white nationalists have always, whatever nation, whatever time, have always opposed people of other colors and of other countries coming into their country. That has always been a key platform of white nationalism, as you've heard, right? If you understand the three instincts, you understand why you don't want other people from other countries of other colors entering the United States. And the KKK used all sorts of terrorist tactics, right, to enforce white supremacy: lynching, rape, other stuff, right? Broadsides, bombings, shootings, cross burnings, poll taxes. They would also leave notes like the one I have pictured here, which can't be more than 60 years old, maybe 50 years old. I just received this last week from a student of mine. This is a white student, and her grandfather got this card put on his windshield in Georgia because he provided credit to black customers at his local grocery store. So they were warning him basically like, you better stop, right? This is post-civil rights stuff. So there was political opposition to integration as we move closer to the 1960s and into the 1960s. Now, this is where we start getting our feet a little warm, all right? And from here on out, I need you to just hold tight, get a stick to bite onto, because some of this stuff I know for some of you is going to be history, and I'll be interested to hear your comments in our discussion stuff later on. But some of you will remember Governor George Wallace. He explicitly, as one of the most powerful people in America, right, as an executive, as the governor, explicitly called for a return to the Confederacy in his 1963 inaugural address, right? Some of you remember this. He called that the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which gave black people citizenship, he called it illegal. Wallace and his many white supporters believed that integration would result in race mixing and what he called amalgamation. He said it would result in mongrelization of society. So he called amalgamation a communist threat that was satanic. So this is where you really begin, that you still see today, the combination of civil rights activists with communism and Satanism from the far right Christian folks. So although Wallace said he wanted to take care of black people, right, he said that he was clearly white supremacist in his inaugural speech. And so he says that integration was satanic and communist. He believed that forced integration took away, here was his logical argument, okay? I don't want to spin forever on this. His logical argument was that forced integration took away the individual rights of white people who wanted to remain separated. He said white people have the individual right to remain separated from black people. And this civil rights movement is putting human rights as a collective over top of and in front of as superseding individual rights. You maybe remember in his speech, and I've got this because you need to hear this. He says today, and this is 1963 in his inaugural speech, again as one of the major leaders in America. This is 60 years ago. Today I've stood where once Jefferson Davis stood and took an oath to my people, and it is very appropriate then that from this cradle of the Confederacy, this very heart of the great Anglo-Saxon, right, this is race language, the great Anglo-Saxon Southland, that today we sound the drum for freedom as have our generations of forebears before us done. This quote's on the slide for you. Time and again down through history, let us rise to the call of the freedom loving blood, right? This is race language again, that is in us, and send our answers to the tyranny that clanks its chains upon the South in the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, the people, right? This is, again, race language. I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say, segregation now, segregation forever, or segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Now, white Christians also developed a theological justification for segregation. So that you just heard some of the political ideas, very typical of the white theological justification was Bob Jones's 1960 radio talk, published in a little pamphlet I have pictured here for you. The question is segregation scriptural? Jones argued, based on Acts 17:26, that yes, it is. You can see Acts 17:26 quoted here on your screen. This is the passage that abolitionists all the way back to the 1800s had used, but he used the back half for segregationism. And God hath made of one blood all nations of men, right? This is the KJV, because many of them were using this. Of one blood all nations of men, for to dwell in the faith of the earth, right? So this is like, oh, look, we're all related, and determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation. The bounds of their habitation. God put us in separate places for different purposes, and to mix together is to go against God's will of separation. Jones called the integration movement and civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. Victims of a satanic and communist plot, right? So satanic and communist are two that you see over and over and over again. I have been charged just the last month with these exact same things. You're anti-gospel and you're a communist Marxist because you believe in social justice and civil rights. These same exact arguments still survive today. Today, it's more on the right wing. In the 1960s, this was common across white conservative, white Protestant, and even some mainline folks would have believed in these kind of arguments. All right, now here's the deal. I need to take a deep breath because it's 9:27, and I know some of you are writing this stuff down, and I just need to be honest. On this thing here, I'm about to roll through 10 slides in a minute, and so you're not going to be able to write it down because I'm going to remind you of key political actions that happened in the civil rights movement. Then I want to get you into the logic of MLK. That's where I'm going to stop and park for a minute. So I will be quite happy to disseminate my PowerPoint. This is new, so I'm pretty excited about, like, this is new material, at least the new way I put it together for you all. And so a lot of this stuff I could talk about forever. I need you to have a context though for MLK and white responses and white Christians and Black Christians fighting for civil rights. Okay, so what I'm going to do really quickly is, you're not going to be able to write. When we get to MLK, then you'll be able to write. Okay, so here's the new era of this the civil rights movement. Okay, in the 1950s, you begin to have legal wins that are usually from the NAACP, which was started by people like W.E.B. Du Bois, people like Ida B. Wells, and lots like them, right? Christians and Black activists who are fighting for civil rights. And so you start to get a lot of wins, but then you have a lot of major social national events. That's what I'm going to tell you about right now, right? So you get a reversal, right? You get a Supreme Court decision in Brown versus the Board of Education saying you cannot segregate. Separate but equal was unconstitutional. Then you get the lynching of Emmett Till, right? So Emmett Till, a young boy, is destroyed by folks in Mississippi. And that goes national because his mother says they're going to see what happened to my boy. And they killed him. Two white guys in Mississippi throw him in the Tallahatchie River, strung a big old fan around his neck. But then he was recovered. And this is, sorry, I mean, if you don't look at the screen, but these are hard images that his mother forced the entire nation to see. Thousands and thousands of people went by the open casket funeral. She says, we will have an open casket funeral. They will see what Christ looks like today. They will see the lynching of Christ today. And because of her courage, Mammy, pictured here, right, looking at her son, who has been destroyed. This is very similar to the new civil rights movement, what a lot of people call third Reconstruction today, beginning in 2012. With Trayvon Martin, and then a list of names that we don't even have time to, even say today, right? So this is really significant. So lynching, and then you get beginning to get the civil rights movement, the bus boycott with Rosa Parks. That's when MLK starts joining. Then you get desegregation of schools. A lot of people look at Arkansas first. You all know right up the road is the first Southern school to integrate in Clinton. Clinton right up the road is the first school. And so I've got pictures here from the Library of Congress where Clinton, Tennessee integrates. They're the first, 1956. But because of that, the governor had to call in the National Guard. You got hundreds of troops. And eventually, white folks bomb that school. But then people, including white Christians, build that thing back. And Clinton, right up the road, is the first Southern school to graduate from an integrated school, both a black young man and young woman from an integrated high school in 1958. You also get Christians step up and become the leaders of the civil rights movement in the SCLC, with women organizing like Ella Baker. The men usually get the spotlight like MLK because, they're at the podium. But the thing that makes this go are the Sylvia Peters, right? They're the organizers. They're the people on the front lines. They're the Ella Bakers, right? They're the heroes of our history. Then you get you get SNCC, right? So the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, organizing sit-ins in the 1960s, just forcing America to reckon with racial discrimination and the division of society. You see these happen all over the place. You see one happen in Knoxville. If you want to see pictures of that, you can go over to the Beck Cultural Exchange Center. They've got pictures of our history here. The Beck is where, I think their slogan is where, African American history is preserved in our region. And they've got pictures of some of these instances. You get freedom rides in the 1960s organized by CORE. You remember Farmer and Thurman. So this is where you see the Christian movement, and it's from its Christian foundation pushing for civil rights. You get that. And then I'm going to pause here and let's think about the logic, because Martin Luther King Jr., no doubt the leader, especially from the Christian side of things, of the civil rights movement. And one of the reasons I think the civil rights movement was so successful in the mid to late 60s, at least in getting legislation, even if it doesn't change the minds of all white Christians, is because of the approach. And so with hindsight, we can see a turning point in 1963, right? So like 1963, you have, Medgar Evers is shot outside of his house in Jackson, Mississippi in 63. King and the SCLC experienced major opposition in Birmingham. King is arrested and writes the letter from Birmingham jail, and that goes wide all over the place. National TV screens are focused on state-sanctioned destruction of nonviolent protesters, and we take a collective breath and say, what's wrong with our systems? These people are supposed to be protecting those folks' constitutional rights, and instead they're destroying these people. And so there was a major check that came. And so in this letter, King does a number of things. This is one of my favorite religious and political writings in American history. But I just want to focus on a couple of things for our purposes, right? The narratives I'm trying to help you understand, which is the struggle for civil rights and the Christian foundation. And what King argues in this, and I'm going to give you, if you want to write these things down, go for it, 4 quick things that King said that are really important. And I think the most important thing is his critique of the white moderate. He argues in this letter that white moderates are the black, what he called Negroes, right? The black people's greatest stumbling block. I need you all to hear this, because this to me is the most prophetic part of King's letter for Christians today. I can think of no other clearer thing that should get under our skin today and drive us to action. He says, white moderates are a greater stumbling block than the KKK. Because they prefer, get this, he says they prefer order and law to justice. He says the white moderate, and I'm quoting him here, prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. That's his quote. The white moderate prefers a negative peace, which is we just don't want conflict. We don't want conflict. We don't want tension, just a negative peace. They prefer a negative peace to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, which requires attention, a constant tension, which forces society to never be okay and to never let down our guard, to see the problems amidst us. He says, this is another quote. He says, we will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people right at Charlottesville and these white nationalists. We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. That's number one, white moderate. Let's don't be that, right? If you're white, let's don't be that. Second, the white church had largely let down the freedom movement, he says. Why? This is the theme for the rest of today's time. He says, instead of speaking out against integration, right, or against speaking about and for integration as just and right, he said white ministers often told their congregations, just follow the orders of desegregation because they were law. They didn't say, all right, we're going to desegregate because that's good and right and gospel. They said, look, it's the law. We're going to do it. And then the other thing is, he says this. He says, I keep hearing white ministers say this. Those are social issues with which the gospel has no real concern. He says that's what white ministers keep saying. Now, you all are among Maitliners, and I'll read you in a minute. You know, even the stuff in your pamphlet has already moved past that, at least on paper. Maybe not in some of the minds, right? And we need to get in there and work on that. But I'm at an institution where all kinds of kids coming in here and their churches still think this stuff, and we got all kinds of work to do under the hood. The gospel is about saving individual souls and about getting people to heaven, not about the social issues. When you go with social issues, you've made the gospel political. King explicitly blasts this and says this vision of the gospel is anemic. You know, and the gospel is, he says the church should be headlights, not taillights in society about this. The church should be the thermostat, not the thermometer. The church should be leading the way and changing those around us. And he says the reason that white Christians are not that is because they've bought into this idea that those are social concerns with which the gospel has no real concern. Third, he says the church is guilty of great neglect. These are all related, right? King looked out at the Southern churches and he asked this. He says, quote, what kind of people worship here? Who is their God? And then he says this, but oh, how we have blemished and scarred that body, the church, through social neglect and through fear of being nonconformists, right? We're not going to conform to the status quo. We're going to come at any system, any structure. That is, now you all, I'm reading it here, right? One of the 4 planks of becoming the beloved community is repairing the breach. And that is, what institutions and systems are broken? Not are institutions and systems broke. Which ones? The assumption here is that they're broken, right? And so a lot of this stuff, at least on paper, this very group has already moved past, but just be aware, King is critiquing this. And the final one, he says, the fourth, the church is in bed with the status quo. The church is in bed with the status quo. But the work in Birmingham will succeed. And he says this because, and this is a quote, because the goal of America is freedom. And I am here to sadly report as a historian, oftentimes the seeds of the American ideals of freedom for all people have been actually the driving force of justice rather than the Christian community and the Christian gospel. And it ought not to be that way. Christians anywhere ought to always be based on the gospel, fighting for the freedom and the goodness of all people. But more often than not, as King says here, it's been America, the nation. Now I'm going to move quickly again because, right, there's a march in 63 for jobs and freedom and equality, right? And King leads that. And then you get some legislation, finally, the Civil Rights Act. You get all this liberal legislation in the 60s. The Civil Rights Act in 64 was the strongest move for Black civil rights since Reconstruction. And then you get, and by the way, that piece of legislation, Southerners tried to filibuster that. They tried to stop it. And it was actually the first time in history that the Senate invoked cloture, which declared the end of a filibuster, and it forced a vote, which won on the Senate floor by 73 to 27. But basically, this act guaranteed access, public access, and it banned discrimination in all public accommodations and public education and employment, regardless of race, right? So this sort of spells the death knell of the legal death knell anyway for America's system of segregation. Obviously, it will go on in all kinds of sordid and underground ways. Then you get the Selma March, right? Because the voting is still being restricted, and so in Selma, although half the folks in Selma, half the population was Black, only 2% were registered voters. Only 2% of the African American community, right? So like most people were being kept from voting, and so the march happens. The stuff. I'm not going to go into all the stuff that you probably learned about, and some of you lived through. But Bloody Sunday happens, and so the forced legislation does happen. You get the 1965 Voting Rights Act, right? And this ends disenfranchisement. It tries to end it, right, by banning literacy tests and any other voting restrictions, right? This act basically said that the federal government will enforce you to allow minorities, especially African Americans, to vote, to register and to vote. And as you can see, it worked early on as it was enforced. You can see the climb in voting. Even more stark are these numbers, right? We looked at these numbers last week. 1940 in Mississippi, less than 1% of voting age Black people were able to vote. This is not because they did not want to vote. This is sheer white terror, right? But you see already by 1976, 60%. Sometimes you must have top-down forced civil rights. Like that's just the reality of, and it worked for a minute, right? Now I do want you to be aware, because this is where this Voting Rights Act comes to bear with the current work for social justice right now. I'm trying to do this quick because I want to get to my last section here, but the 1965 Voting Rights Act, you can see all the counties here in red who were covered by this special coverage formula. So there was a coverage formula, and this required any jurisdiction. So anything in red here is a jurisdiction which was determined to have a history of discrimination in voting practices, right? And they determined this by a couple of different measures, right? So if your jurisdiction, if less than half of the eligible citizens were registered to vote, then you were dinged, right? Or if less than half voted in the presidential election in the 1960s, then you were dinged. And you were covered. And what the coverage said, you can't enact any new policy without passing it at the federal level. So the federal government is going to make sure that your new policy is not racist. Now, here's the deal. The reason I want to just mention this so you're aware of how this plays out today. In 2013, the Supreme Court decided that the coverage formula was unconstitutional. And so jurisdictions no longer needed to pre-clear their new voting policies, right? And so if you've been following the news over the last 8 years, you know that the ACLU and the NAACP have been very busy in court since then, because almost immediately a number of states passed laws that were potentially discriminatory, and in many times in law have been upheld as discriminatory. In fact, in 2016, one of the North Carolina voting laws was declared explicitly that the court case said basically the court said that this law had intentionally targeted African Americans with almost surgical precision, finding ways to make it harder for Black people to vote. And therefore that was stopped. And you're seeing this happening right now, right? For those of you who don't know, this is explicit. These are any policy that makes it harder to vote, always, even if not intention, in effect, targets lower income and minority communities every single time. We've always seen it. We've had all the studies. It happens. Oftentimes people support these kind of policies without that intention. Sometimes they support it with the intention. We have them on record. I'll give you some of those as well. What happens in the 1960s is you get in the the back half of the 60s, you start getting riots in places like Watts and other places, right? So the protests lead to riots, and you get this bubbling up of just anger and disgust and just ready to move on with the system. And you have a couple of different kinds of responses. You have some response to riots and even violence, right, from people like MLK. MLK does not condone violence, but on the riots, he says of Watts, riots are the language of the oppressed. They're the language of the unheard. You got to recognize that. And he even goes on record saying the only real riot prevention is civil rights. He doesn't advocate violence. He doesn't advocate, however many millions of dollars of damage were done in Watts and other places. But he explains that as the voice of the oppressed. Whereas Billy Graham, right, and you start getting the white moderate response is, we need law and order. We need law and order. That's the only way forward here. That's the only way forward here, right? Because they're seeing people like Graham and politicians like Nixon who come at the same time, who Graham supports, will argue that the only way forward is law and order. So you start getting a great divide between activist responses, even nonviolent one, and moderate responses who believe the only way forward is a crackdown. All right, so let's do our last section here, which is race relations, and I've got maybe about 12 minutes to cover race relations from 1970 to 2020. I mean, have I set myself up for a hard go here? Yes, I have, but that's all right. So immediately following the 1960s, what we get from the Christian side of the movement is the liberation theologies that really take the world by storm. Liberation theologies in America, James Cohen, who I have pictured here, leads the Black liberation theology movement. So Black liberation theology used as its starting point for reflection the experience of daily life for Black people in America. And Cohen argued that a central characteristic of the God of the Bible and of Jesus's kingdom is liberation of the oppressed. In fact, he said, anybody that says that liberation of the oppressed is not at the heart of the identity of God is missing the Christian gospel and is probably outside of the Christian tradition. So he found that traditional theology in the West had sought to depict God as favoring the powerful. But Cohen's liberation theology found God in solidarity with the oppressed, with the powerless, with the marginalized. And so from that perspective, he said, what does God look like in America? Oh, God is Black, right? And you see the quote here on the screen, Christ is Black, not because of some cultural or psychological need that I have, right? But because and only because Christ enters into our world where the poor, the despised, and the Black are disclosing that he is with them, right? He is enduring their humiliation and pain and transforming oppressed slaves into liberated servants. This is where the prosperity gospel and the liberation theology and the gospel of liberation theology start with the same starting point, which is the kingdom of God is about here and now. Prosperity gospel says, therefore, if you have enough faith and give enough, at least in its most, egregious forms, then God will bless you and keep you safe. Liberation theology says God is, because the kingdom of God is here, God isn't necessarily in suffering, but God is with us in our suffering. The very identity of God is with the suffering. You have lots of other liberation theologies that form out of this, right? You have womanist theology, you have feminist theologians from a white middle class female perspective, saying from our centered perspective, here's what we're learning about God and theology. And then you have womanist theology, which centers Black women's experiences as a unique way to understand theology and human experience. You also have Latina or Hispanic women theologians. They develop mujerista theology, which centers Hispanic women. Then you have post-colonial liberationist theologies as well in South Africa. You have Korean Minjung theology at the same time. So it's kind of a worldwide liberation movement that really says the gospel is about liberation of the oppressed. It is not about getting in bed with those in power. You have segregationists quick who immediately respond in the 70s, right? So the same people, Bob Jones. So what happens is Brown versus the Board of Education only forces segregation on public schools. So private schools are allowed to remain segregated if it's based on religion. And so what you have is all kinds of segregation academies pop up all over the place. Just in the late 1960s in Mississippi, there are over 30 private academies. Almost all of them are Christians. So these are white Christians. In some places, like in Mississippi, you go from 738 white students in that county in the public school to zero in 2 years, because white people they just get around the law. Now in 1971, though, there's a law, the Supreme Court case applies enforced segregation to private schools as well, but they don't really enforce it. The court says it, so it's law of the land, but like Brown, it's going to take decades because people are going to have to sue, right? So you have to have Black families suing white folks, and usually white Christians who have segregated on purpose. Where that really comes to fore is Bob Jones University, who kind of leads the Christian right, the religious right. They start not with abortion, which, if you know the story of the religious right, most people think they start with abortion and rally. That eventually is the major thing, but early on it's segregation of schools. So Bob Jones has discriminatory practices, right? And what you end up with, long story short, the Supreme Court takes away Bob Jones's nonprofit status and takes away federal aid to students in this 1982 case, declaring that you cannot discriminate, even if you're a private university, and say because of your Christian principles, you don't believe, for instance, in interracial dating, which is one of the things that they were being dinged for. They allowed Black people to come if they were married, right? Because they were terrified of, mongrelization, as they called it. Everybody see me doing scare quotes, I hope, right? This is their word, mixing of the races. And so the law kind of forces them outside, but you continue to have that. They continue though, and then they'll say, okay, fine, single Black people can come, but you're not allowed to have interracial dating. So up until the really recent present did Bob Jones, I think it was 2017 when they finally got full status back from federal government, because they continue to have these racist policies. Another major push you get is law and order politics. So Nixon began by 1966 using the phrase law and order to describe what he thought the US needed and what the civil rights leaders lacked. And he explicitly said this, right? It was broader than that, right? It appealed to folks who thought American society was just slipping into anarchy with all of the 1960s protests. So law and order politics, if you're not aware, fueled an aggressive criminal justice criminal justice system that eventually led to what we currently have in our prison industrial complex. If you're not aware, this is the moment where we begin to explain why today the US, although it only accounts for 5% of the world's population, we have 25% of the world's incarcerated people. This is at the forefront of today's civil rights movement, if you're not aware. With policing reform as well. These are the two big issues right now. So Nixon started to move to harsher sentencing and to incentivize building more prisons. And all of this began and led to substantial increases in America's carceral state. Now, Billy Graham and white evangelicals, white Protestants oftentimes, in 1972, this is the first presidential candidate that he supports, that he advocates for. And from the 1970s on, you'll see white conservative Protestants make their final move from the Democratic Party, which they had supported back in 1930s, to finally becoming thoroughly Republican in their voting policies, right? And they dominated in the 1980s, getting Reagan into office as well. I know that was very, very brief. I do whole lectures on some of that stuff, but I'm just making sure these are on your radar. So what happens then in society, and what white Christians kind of push for, the idea of colorblind policies, right? This is one of the key responses to the 1960s legislation. So you got 1960s liberal legislation saying you can't discriminate. Now, today, most people who support colorblind policies, y'all know what colorblind policies are, right? You say, what the way for equality is to make laws that don't see color, so that we can just have everybody has the exact same equal, the idea is the exact same equal opportunities, and we won't take race or sex into account in our policies. We'll just pretend that everybody's at the same starting place. Now, today, most people who support colorblind policies, which includes some conservatives and some liberals, mostly white, but even some Black folks support this, believe that it should produce an equal playing field, right? That's the purpose of a colorblind policy. That is, their intentions are not racist, even if the effects of colorblind policies do not change the racial disparities that exist in our society, disparities that exist because of the 400-year history we've been unpacking here. But at one point in time, the racial nature of using colorblind policies was a conscious choice, right? To continue racism. I can give you two examples. One was Nixon's closest advisor, H.R. Haldeman, right? He said Nixon, I'm quoting here from him. He said Nixon emphasized that you have to face the fact that the whole problem is the Blacks. Now, the key is, he says, to devise a system that recognizes that while not appearing to. So you make policies, right, that recognizes it, but it doesn't appear to. Now, of course, one wonders how well Nixon hid his, implicit, hidden racism, because only 4% of Black voters voted for him. right? That's even less than the percentage of black voters who voted for Donald Trump. In the first one, which was like about 8%. So Nixon wasn't hiding this from anyone. The second I'll give you is from Lee Atwater. He's pictured here with Reagan, right? So Atwater was a Reagan White House advisor. He was a strategist for George H.W. Bush. He was one of the youngest ever chairs of the Republican National Convention. And in an 1981 interview, he said this. I'm not going to say the N-word, though he said it. Okay, I'll just say N-word. He said, you start out in 1954 by saying N-word, N-word, N-word. By 1968, you can't say N-word. That hurts you. It backfires. You say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract. Now this is all quoting from him, right? Now you're talking about cutting taxes. And these things you're talking about are totally economic things. And a byproduct of them is that blacks get hurt worse than whites. He says, we want to cut this is much more abstract than even the busing thing. And it's a hell of a lot more than abstract than N-word, N-word, right? This is from a 1981 interview. So people were aware of these things. So a different version that opposed colorblind policies were affirmative action policies and continue to be, right? So affirmative action policies, they differed, and President Kennedy in the 60s was the first to use affirmative action to denote the need for positive actions to end racial discrimination, right? So affirmative action programs were meant to reduce the historical patterns of discrimination, some of which you see on this screen. I'm not going to explain them all because I don't really have time to do that, right? But the hope here, the idea behind affirmative action is the idea that it says, hey, look, we recognize that this is a 100-yard race. Some of you are starting on the 80-yard line, and some of you are starting on the minus 20-yard line because of 350 years of discriminatory policies. And we need to make policies that are conscious of that and take that into effect, right? And so these aim at equity. These aim at achieving equity, right? That is reducing racial disparities rather than pretending like everybody's on an equal starting point. These are the difference in these particular policies. As you see here, one of my favorite quotes from Ibram Kendi, when you truly believe that the racial groups are equal, when you see the racial disparities like you're seeing here, you also believe racial disparities are the result of racial discrimination. Now, some white folks who believe themselves not to be racist, and some just straight white racists, say, no, the real reason for this discrimination is behavior. You just need to pull up your bootstraps and act better. They don't see the systems at work. There was a racial reconciliation movement in the 1970s all the way up through the 90s that was led by black folks. I don't want to spend a lot of time unpacking that right now because I want to make sure you get the last couple of points here on where the major problem for today, and this may be stuff that we can talk a little bit more about next week, Sylvia, but what I would say, the long history of this and the way where we can sort of land the plane today, without me covering, I've got 3 or 4 more slides that I won't hit today, but I'll bring some of that information into our discussion and maybe next week. The key problem, I would argue, and this goes beyond just evangelicals, it's white evangelicals and it's white mainliners as well, and it's just white in general, is what are the explanations right now for racial disparities? And what is the best way forward? And so white people oftentimes, but especially white evangelicals, as this study shown, believe in accountable individualism. Their worldview and the cosmos is only describable and understandable through individual actions, individual relationships. If you succeed, it's because your individual effort. If you fail, it's because your individual failure. If you want to fix race relations, you need individuals making good relationships. If you want to fix society, you need individual Christians being converted, making society better. And therefore, they're anti-structural. That is, they cannot understand structures or systems as the explanation. For instance, oh, look at the disproportionate number of black people in prison. They say, well, that's the explanation. Then is, well, it's not because our criminal system has, over sentenced black drugs that black people use, or, criminalized blackness or black behavior. It's because black people are more criminal, right? So it's an individual, lays it on, that's which is called cultural racism. It lays it at the feet of somehow, oh, this group of people is culturally or by behavior acting a way that's more criminal, right? And so that's where, well, I'll show you maybe in our discussion time, or certainly next week, white folks explain racial disparities in very different ways. And it's what we call the racial perception gap. And it's all rooted in this, what I'm going to call individualism versus structuralism. Individualism versus structuralism. If you can get that in your mind, we'll continue talking about that for the rest of our time. That will be a theme running throughout next week. Individualism versus structuralism. All right, I'm going to stop sharing and stop talking. Sorry, Sylvia, I went right up to 10.
Sylvia, you're muted.
Yes, thanks, Dr. Gorman. Just a remarkable lecture. Um, and it resonated a lot with me because I lived a life where there was a woman in my family who was a journalist, Ethel Payne. She was called the First Lady of the Black Press. Um, and she lived in Washington, D.C., and was the second Black person to be accredited as a White House correspondent. And she started her career in 1952 when President Eisenhower had his first press conference. And so our family has lived through all these things, and it was just amazing to hear you talk about it today. You are a national treasure. I think you're a great influencer. And for those of you who want to hang around, we're going to have our coffee hour. Carolyn, can you, not Carolyn, Gigi, our person who's going